When mother of four Casei Jones disappeared from her home in Florida, friends and family had no idea what to make of it. But when all four children disappeared in the weeks and months after, it became obvious that something truly terrible had happened. Now, we all have different standards when it comes to describing pure evil, but I am sure that many of you would agree that the man behind all of this comes very close. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. I'm your host Adrian, and today we're looking at the case of the Jones family. Now, this story is seriously dark and explores a few very haunting thoughts, and so, with that said, viewer discretion is advised. But before we begin, and just to let you know that I post true crime and strange cases here weekly, so if that is your sort of thing, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of the Jones family. Summerfield, Florida. Known as an unincorporated community in Marion County, Summerfield provides the opportunity to live harmoniously alongside rivers, lakes, and other pristine natural landscapes. Found 60 miles northwest of Orlando, it's located close to the center of Florida's peninsula. You'll find Jacksonville to the north, Tampa to the south, and a large expanse of beautiful coastline to the east. Now, there isn't much to say about this place, and in fact, there is so little online to read about that I found myself struggling for information. TripAdvisor claims that the Dragonflower Winery is the #1 thing to do in Summerfield, but everything else just seems to be golf courses and a farm. So yeah, with a population of around 27,000 residents, the town has remained small throughout the decades, with attention instead being given to its nearby coastal cities. However, it does have one substantial redeeming feature, and that is that the rent is cheap. And in addition to its highly rated schools, it also has one of the state's lowest crime rates, which is probably why the entire town was so shocked to hear about this case. And in the year 2019, right next to Highway 27, we find the Jones family, consisting of Father Wayne, Mother Casey, and their 4 children, Cameron, Preston, Macaulay, and Ayanna, all of which who ranged in age between 1 to 10 years old. Now, this family of 6 came from various backgrounds. The older children, Cameron and Preston, were born from one of Casey's previous relationships, with Macaulay and Ayanna being Michael's only biological children. For clarity, Michael did in fact have other children from a previous relationship, but fortunately they do not apply to this story. Beginning with Michael, he was born on May 1st, 1981 and grew up in Vermont. And although I wish I could say that these formative years were good for him, they unfortunately weren't, as sadly he was a victim to the abuse of his father and experienced an impoverished childhood. Teachers unaware of this situation described the young boy as lost and confused, and in hindsight it's obvious to see why he appeared that way. And although his father would eventually be locked up in prison, his mother fell into a new relationship with another man, who unfortunately then repeated his father's same offences. Now, Michael finally experienced a period of normality in his late teenage years when he joined the US Navy as a medic. It's during this time that he met his first wife, Sarah. And just like that, Michael was now a family man as the couple welcomed 3 children into the world. This new sense of structure, responsibility, and teamwork helped push him in the right direction. And after a few years of service, his wife helped him secure a job at the local veterinary clinic. It turns out that Michael loved it here and was said to run the place. But the change in job would also lead him to a new woman too, and her name was Casey. Now, Casey had a very different childhood when compared to Michael. She was born on December 23rd, 1986 to her mother Nikki and father David, and between these differences in dates, she was 5 years Michael's senior. Growing up in Goshen, Indiana, she attended Mary Beck Elementary School, and after graduating from Elkhart Memorial High School, she moved to Florida in 2009. Initially a dog groomer, she eventually progressed to be a vet technician, which is also known as a vet nurse here in the UK. Friends described Casey as an amazing, kind, and caring woman who wouldn't hesitate to give you the shirt off her back, and in addition to this, she had a sweet smile and a beautiful laugh. It was during her time working at the same vet clinic as Michael that, no surprise, they first crossed paths, and this chance encounter would massively change both of their directions in life. From here, a colleague kinship developed into a friendship, and soon after that, the two began to experience romantic feelings. And so, they began an affair, this leading to both of them leaving their former partners for each other, and soon after this, the two began a family of their own. Now, although Michael would become the stepfather to both Cameron and Preston, his former children would stay with his ex-wife, Sarah. But in December 2016, and again in August 2018, Michael and Casey welcomed their own children, Macaulay and Ayana, into the world. After marrying on Halloween of 2017, Michael and Casey's family moved into a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom trailer found on Southeast 86th Terrace in Summerfield, Florida. And although the family of 6 didn't have much room to physically expand into, the rent was modest and they were happy in each other's company. It is worth noting here that Michael's history wasn't squeaky clean. In the year of 2015, he was arrested for burglary after stealing money, computer equipment and a firearm from his job. Now, this was actually the vet clinic that he worked in with both Sarah and Casey, and unfortunately, Casey forgave him enough to help him in this situation, and she even assisted him as she looked after their family as he fled to New Mexico to avoid arrest. Casey was a very proud mother to her children and loved relishing in their development. Thinking ahead and wanting a way to remember these happy memories forever, she created a YouTube channel to upload special milestones along the way. Many of these videos include Michael playing with his daughters, playing and fooling around with his wife, and the family happily spending their weekends together. And looking into their day-to-day lives through this lens seemed to portray a perfectly content family. Michael appeared to be calm and generally happy with his life, and although Casey was behind the camera the majority of the time, she was often heard laughing and giggling. So, looking through these videos, my only real conclusion is that their lives were relatively carefree and happy in each other's company. But the fact of the matter is, this couldn't be any further from the truth. And tragically, soon after her last recorded video, this ideal and happy fantasy would be shattered forever. And behind the door of 14680 Southeast 86th Terrace, one of the worst imaginable nightmares was about to play out. It was on the 10th of July 2019 when suspicions started to arise. Friends and family of Casey noted that all of a sudden she stopped taking calls or arranging plans with them, and when she did message them on Facebook or anywhere else, something seemed very out of character. The way she typed out messages and the mannerisms of these messages were not like her usual self. And one of those who stopped hearing from her was Richard Bowers, which by the way was Casey's previous husband and the father to Preston and Cameron. When he arrived at the property on July 27th to take his sons home for a couple of weeks, there was no sign of her either. And after asking where she was, Michael replied to Richard to say that she was out of town. Since Richard and Casey had previously argued, he figured she didn't want to see him, and thinking nothing more of it, he returned home with his kids. It was on August the 1st that Casey's mother, Nikki, received a text message from Casey's number. The message asked if she could watch Macaulay and Ayana for a couple of weeks. Now, Nikki agreed to her daughter's request, but never actually saw her when the kids were dropped off at her residence. Michael was the only one present at the time, which Nikki thought was slightly odd, as she hadn't actually seen or spoken to Casey in person or even receive a voice call for over 3 weeks. So anyway, while both sets of kids were gone, Michael was not actually alone in the house. And during this time frame, he looked after his first set of children from his former partner Sarah. But by August the 11th, Sarah's children had returned home, and Cameron and Preston were back in the custody of Michael and supposedly Casey. By now, it had been weeks since anyone had actually physically seen or spoken to Casey, and all day-to-day arrangements were handled by Michael. But the very unsettling and concerning situation worsened after this, and moving forward, no one would hear from or see Preston or Cameron either. It was around this time that Michael posted an advertisement on Facebook Marketplace to sell 2 twin mattresses, which eventually were sold to a couple living in the nearby Summerfield area. On August the 17th, the couple went by to the Jones residence to pick up these 2 mattresses. But it was a very unusual encounter. For one, the mattresses smelled like death, and Michael was behaving very erratically. And despite Richard wishing his son a happy birthday on August the 22nd, he never actually received a response from anyone. And that's when the alarm bells started to ring. And only a few days later, on August the 28th, both Macaulay and Ayana were next to fall silent to the world. To add to the strange circumstances, several other things were happening during this time frame. To begin with, the Jones family were served with an eviction notice, meaning they were expected to move out within the next 2 weeks. And then, as many in and around the Florida area will remember, Hurricane Dorian struck. Dorian was an extremely powerful Category 5 hurricane, and at the time, was the strongest to hit the northwestern Bahamas on record. Back in Florida, a state of emergency was declared for the entire state. Many sought shelter, either nearby in public emergency shelters, or by traveling away from the incoming disaster. One of those fleeing the area, although strangely by himself, was Michael, who travelled north to stay with his ex-wife and their children. Despite staying there for the full 10 days, and despite the ongoing disaster down in Florida, Sarah never actually saw Michael call his wife or kids. And although this didn't sit well with her, she knew that Michael and Casey were having issues, so she never bothered to ask. It was just after Hurricane Dorian passed, and while the Jones family was still away from the property, that neighbours reported a very foul smell coming from within the home. The landlord was eventually alerted to this, and since the Jones family were technically supposed to be out by now, he decided to look through the windows and into the property. Although the home was still full of furniture and personal belongings, there was no doubt that the smell was absolutely horrendous, and could only be described as something dead. Now, there are many questions as to why the family and friends around Casey and her children took so long to inform the authorities about their disappearance. And although there were concerns for Casey's well-being, the family thought that maybe Michael was evading the law again, and therefore the family were hiding for his safety. But on September the 14th, 2019, which was 66 days after Casey went radio silent, Nikki finally had enough, and the Marion County Sheriff's Office was called to request a welfare check. 66 days had passed since anyone had spoken to Casey, 34 days since Cameron and Preston were last seen, and 17 days since Macaulay and Ayana had fallen silent as well. Naturally, officers were very worried to hear this, and so the welfare check was conducted immediately. Arriving at the residence shortly before midnight, deputies learned from local residents that not only had anyone seen the Jones family in over 2 weeks, but an ongoing foul smell was emanating from the property. Police officers immediately recognized the smell. It was reminiscent of a decomposing human or animal, and to add to the ever-growing list of concerning clues, the house was now empty and looked recently cleaned. In addition to this, some of the floors looked brand new, but one of the old floors was stained red.
Alright, and the whole property was cleaned out, correct? And Joe, did you have a cleaning crew come in and clean up, or? Can you hear me, Joe?
What's that?
Did you have a cleaning crew come in and clean up, or did you just have a guy do it?
So I'm gonna plead the fifth on that.
Okay. No, I'm just talking about who cleaned up. Like, not the property. I don't care about the property. Like mopped the floor. Who mopped the floor and stuff.
Yeah, one of my guys mopped the floor. I'm not sure which one.
Okay. So you didn't hire a crew to come do it. Just one of your guys that normally work for you.
Correct.
Okay. That's all I needed to know. Did the guy that you had clean up? Did he tell you he put some fans in all the rooms and have little fans running?
Yeah, because it smelled.
Okay. Do you know what he used to clean up with? Did he tell you?
No.
Were there any, did you say there were some repairs done?
Alright, officer, I think that's it. I think I'm gonna ask you guys to leave.
Okay, well, we're walking right out the front door right now.
Although officers initially entered the property with the homeowner's permission, they were turned away after asking too many questions. But nevertheless, the clues left behind were enough to concern the authorities gravely, and so every effort was made to contact the Jones family. Unfortunately, investigators came back with nothing but silence despite every effort to locate them. So finally, a missing persons post was created and uploaded to Facebook, highlighting that Casey, Preston, Cameron, Macaulay, and Ayana were now missing and considered endangered. And this is where the story's circumstances change very quickly, as later that very same day, police officers in Brantley County, Georgia responded to an alarming scene. 170 miles north of the Summerfield home, Michael Jones had veered off-road and crashed the family vehicle into a concrete sewage tunnel. And although the man managed to get out of the car unharmed, the vehicle was a complete write-off. As soon as police officers arrived, they sensed a very putrid smell, and upon asking Michael what the smell was, he had a very awful confession to make. Michael confirmed that if they were to go looking inside, they would tragically find the decaying body of his wife. Furthermore, he was willing to show them where he'd buried the bodies of his children. Michael was obviously arrested immediately after this, and after telling authorities where to go to find his slain kids, Charlton County received the call to search for them. Located in a woodland just off Highway 301, a large patch of fresh earth was located, and horrifyingly, under the recently disturbed soil lay the bodies of Cameron, Preston, Macaulay, and Ayana. Those around the Jones family were distraught, terrified, and disgusted to hear the news. Although they had already shared a great deal of concern over their whereabouts, many could not even begin to fathom Michael's gruesome actions. And all of this had to be one of the most horrific outcomes possible. Their deaths severely affected multiple families. Richard Bowers lost both of his sons and his ex-wife to the man she had left him for, and Nikki now faced the awful act of burying her daughter and 4 grandchildren. Moving forward, Michael's actions would permanently affect the mental health of many people around his slaughtered family, and one of those most jolted was his ex-wife, Sarah. It turns out that the children she and Michael shared stayed in his house multiple times after he murdered his wife, and during that time, they were under the full supervision of a murderer. And to add to this, if you remember correctly, Michael had even sheltered with Sarah and the kids for multiple days during Hurricane Dorian. And shockingly, all of this had happened after he murdered his entire family, meaning that Sarah too, for more than a week, had lived with a mass murderer. Now, considering the severity and depravity of his actions, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to consider him killing his other biological children and Sarah too. But luckily, this never crossed his mind, meaning that Sarah and the kids are extremely lucky to be unharmed. But instead, all of them now face the enormous task of processing their father's actions and somehow learning to trust again. Following his arrest, Michael was willingly interviewed by officers, and during his interrogation, he was calm, collected, and concise with his actions. There was no attempt to deceive or lie to officers, and Michael even expressed his thankfulness for being caught, because, quote, he couldn't do anything right. Now, according to Michael, the entire event was prompted by a heated argument, during which Casey had accused him of cheating with another woman. But Michael denied these claims, which led to tension between the two. Casey then allegedly approached him with a baseball bat, and after prodding him with it, Michael lost all sense of self-control. He grabbed the bat off her before striking her multiple times across the head. And tragically, Michael did not stop beating his wife until he was certain that she was dead. He then placed her body in a plastic tote bag and stored it in the closet before cleaning all traces of visible blood. And in the meantime, all 4 children were asleep in the house. Following her death, Michael began to spin a web of lies and deceit to cover his tracks over the next few weeks. He used Casey's phone to send text and Facebook messages to friends and family, so others would think that she was still alive. It was on August the 10th, which was 31 days after he murdered her, that he decided to kill Casey's 2 sons. Without going into explicit details and out of respect, Michael killed Cameron by strangulation. He then waited until the next night before killing Preston, in which he used cable ties to strangle him to death. As the weeks turned into months, and especially in Florida's hot and humid weather, Michael faced a new ghastly problem, and as some of you may have already guessed, that was decomposition. He began to use cat litter to help soak up the bodily fluids, though as we already know, this didn't stop heads from turning, and the smell began to spread. On August 23rd, with his wife and 2 stepsons already dead, Michael was served an eviction notice, thus adding even more pressure onto him. He could no longer keep the bodies in the house, and if he were even to try and get away with his awful actions, he'd need to change the flooring. 5 days later, on August the 28th, Michael took his 2 daughters to the local police department. He sat with them on a park bench opposite the area, as he tried to build the strength to turn himself in. But sadly, this determination of his dissolved into pure cowardice. And when he got home, that spinelessness reared its ugly head to reveal his true monstrous self. Michael drowned both of his daughters in the bathtub that very same night. 2 days later, and during the hurricane, Michael made his way to Jacksonville to stay with his ex-wife. And unknown to her and everyone else at the time, he made the drive up with all 5 bodies in the trunk of his car. They remained in there for 16 days until Michael buried his children. And then, as we all know, finally he was caught. At the time of their deaths, Casey was 33 years old, Cameron was 10, Preston 5, Macaulay 3, and Ayana only 11 months. Moving into the legal proceedings of this case, Michael's trial began on December the 8th, 2022, and as you can likely imagine, the chances of him coming out as a free man were basically non-existent. Due to the lack of premeditation to her death, Michael would be tried for the second-degree murder of Casey, but moving forward he would face first-degree murder charges for all 4 children. And since he'd already confessed to their murders, the least he would get behind bars was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, there is one very big caveat here, and that is, with this being Florida, the death penalty is still very possible. Post-mortem autopsies and police reports presented in court confirmed some very saddening details. Cameron had suffered a broken mandible or lower jaw during his death, and a plastic zip tie was observed to be around Preston's neck. Macaulay's and Diana's remains were located inside a small plastic tote. Found inside the bag with them was a baby bottle with Diana's name on it, as well as a small pair of girls' sandals. Casey's body had been wrapped in a rug and a black and white shower curtain. The front of her skull was damaged in a manner consistent with that of a massive blunt force trauma, very likely from an object rather than an accident. During his trial, the defense argued that jurors should spare Michael's life for a variety of reasons. This included his so-called abusive relationship with Casey, where apparently Casey was the abuser, his traumatic childhood, the mixture of drugs he was on at the time of the murders, and a complex history with his mental health. The defense noted that Michael suffered a very abusive childhood after becoming a victim of child molestation by his father, and eventually his stepfather as well. It was also claimed that Michael had a well-known history of banging his head against the walls and floor, all of which was in a desperate effort to silence the voices in his head. And although this was Michael's angle, and friends and family were able to confirm some of his difficulties, some also testified that, in reality, he was the actual abuser of his wife throughout their marriage. Not that Casey was entirely a saint on all counts either, as her own sister suggested that she too could be aggressive, stubborn, and physically violent. The defense would also claim that Casey often dominated him, and that his recent traumatic experiences and episodes led to a free fall of psychotic chaos. Michael testified that he was subjected to nagging, poking, and prodding, and that all of the stress was starting to detrimentally affect him. He also justified the murder of their children by saying that they could now be with their mother. Dr. Yenis Castillo, a clinical and forensic psychologist, concluded that there is evidence that Michael came from a dysfunctional family, with evidence of sexual, mental, and physical abuse, along with intense violence. But the prosecution was not forgiving in the slightest. All 5 murders were spread over 49 days, highlighting that Michael had plenty of time to calm down and rationalize his emotions. Instead, he proceeded with cold calculation. At each interval of time, Michael engaged in a web of lies as he covered his tracks, using his wife's phone to deceive multiple people, lying to his ex-wife, and even asking her for a fake alibi. Being interviewed while his trial was ongoing, Michael's ex-wife Sarah declared, "I wish they'd already hung him up and been done, because I don't think he deserves to walk another day on Earth." In Florida, defendants convicted of first-degree murder can be sentenced to death if the jury unanimously recommends such an outcome, and in Michael's case, on January the 13th, 2023, that is exactly what happened. Now, this decision will ultimately be left to the judge Anthony Tatti, who has not yet scheduled a date for his sentencing. However, given the circumstances, he will very likely follow through with this verdict. This has to be one of the truly darkest crimes I have ever covered here. Michael Jones killed 5 of those closest to him, 4 of whom were innocent children that all depended on him. He killed them over a time frame of 49 days, and on 4 separate occasions. And unlike the murder of his wife, this was not a case of losing self-control in the heat of the moment. The man went back for more violence time and time again. Whether one believes in the death sentence or not, it is evident that Michael's actions place him near the very top of the list of criminals for such a punishment. Murdering his wife is a terrible thing that cannot be forgiven, but to murder 4 innocent children is so unspeakably vile that it's almost suffocating to think about. Through Casey's videos, it's clear to see how sweet all 4 children were, and how a father could do such a thing to his own flesh and blood is honestly beyond reprehensible. I can't even find the word severe enough to describe him. During his trial, Casey's sister said that the death of her sister and children has devastated their family, and the pain has been torture. She eventually had to quit her job, as it involved the triggering sight of children's clothing, and following her unemployment, she was unable to leave her bed for more than 6 months. The pain of knowing that her 4 nephews and nieces will never graduate from school, get married, or have their own children plagues her mind, and at times, it feels almost too much to bear. Nothing can ever be done to fill the voids left behind by Casey and her kids. Now, the gap between these murders technically makes Michael a serial killer, in addition to other well-known titles such as Family Annihilator and Worst Parent of the Year. I honestly can't even begin to fathom his actions, and while I do sympathize for his childhood, which was filled with trauma and violence, it does not explain or justify his actions. I sincerely hope that the families and friends involved in this awful tragedy will find the peace and comfort that they deserve in the years to come. So I'm glad to wrap up this chilling case, folks, but I wanted to thank you so much for being here with me today for another video about Coffeehouse crime. I do have one question for all of you though. What do you think should happen to Michael? Does he deserve life in prison or the death sentence? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Just a few words to finish up today's video, but thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't yet and like the video to help me out. And of course, I'll be back again very soon for another video, but until that moment arrives, please remember to look after each other and of course, stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.